Hello and welcome to Order and Liberty, the podcast that gives hot takes on the latest in political events. And I am your host, Nick Hankoff, along with the co-host, José Niño. And Jose, today I'm going to be continuing what we started in the last episode. We wanted to make it around the world, and there was so much to cover. You have a fantastic article up at the Mises Institute about a geopolitical reset. And so this is sort of a part two. And we're focusing on Iran and the Middle East in this one. But, you know, the world, foreign policy casts a wide net. So even if we start there, who knows where this might take us. But I do want to get your perspective on Iran because, you know, President Trump, as we said in the last episode, cast a different vision for the U.S. foreign policy. But at the same time, with Iran, he disagreed with the Iran nuclear deal, and is following some leads towards the Middle East that maybe we have some nuanced opinions on, hard disagreements with, maybe some appreciation for. So why don't you take it away, Jose, first on just how you see Iran in the context of global foreign policy and emerging alliances around the world, and then how that comes back to Trump and his foreign policy.
Well, thank you again, Nick, for interviewing me on this article. I think it's quite important, especially in a time when so much outrage is occupying people's mental space right now. Foreign policy is a big issue because it does involve a lot of American blood and treasure being poured into oftentimes really dumb and unjust conflicts. As far as the Iran topic is concerned, the Trump administration has been, I'd say, a pretty mixed bag. And actually, I'm starting to be kind of worried due to the fact that from the start, Trump kind of bought into the neocon frame of trying to stop Iran from having a nuke at all costs. And that's involved the obvious maximum pressure sanctions, and then the targeted strike of Qasem Soleimani in Iraq. And now I think that this is going to only ratchet up further, that the UN arms embargo has been lifted on Iran, where it can now have access to Russian and Chinese firepower. And because of the fact that Trump has so many swampy people in his foreign policy cadre, I think a second term for Trump may actually be kind of dangerous due to the fact that he's going to be a lame duck and he's no longer going to be up for re-election or subject to the wrath of the voters that generally voted for him to end military conflicts, not just wars, but also unilateral strikes and whatnot. And he may have to appeal to the Zionist base, especially donor base, that got him into power. And that element has been very toxic in the Trump administration since the beginning. I'm referring to the Sheldon Adelson crowd and all those people. And my big concern with Trump is that he's kind of bought into that. Also, as well, with the anti-Russia counter signaling, that he's in effect created a balancing coalition inadvertently that's comprised of Russia, Iran, and now China. The third country is going to be interesting because China has already signed a big deal with Iran. It's a 25-year deal, essentially, that is a partnership in trade, culture, politics, and security. It's worth about $400 billion. and they're just going to integrate further the Iran and China. So it seems that now a lot of these countries that the US gets sanctioned by, they have fallback options. They can either just fall into Russia or China's orbit or some Eurasian orbit, because it seems that even Russia and China are starting to coalesce a lot. That's why you hear the term the dragon bear in a lot of international relations circles, because of the fact that these two countries are becoming more aligned in terms of their interests, despite the fact that they have a history of being strategic rivals and at times enemies, largely due to the simple fact that they have an enemy in common, the US. The US is constantly sanctioning, using subversive operations within the country, promoting regime change in some shape or form. And a lot of these countries are going to form kind of like an international version of the concert of Europe to create a balancing coalition against the US. And anytime that the US tries to pursue future interventions, I think it's going to be met with lots of resistance and much stronger states, because all these neocons have been saying for years, Iran's collapsing due to the sanctions that they push, but it's just not the case. It seems that it actually gets even stronger, the state does. And now it's only going to get stronger if it joins some type of Eurasian partnership. And I think that's one of the biggest fears of the neocon and neoliberal interventionist crowd, is that there's a Eurasian bloc that forms that challenges the West, and that could turn pretty messy if they overstep their boundaries. And by they, I mean the US government and all of the interests that are promoting these never ending conflicts. So, on the Iran policy, I'd give the Trump administration a C minus. It could be worse, but I'm of the opinion that, as well, with these pseudo peace deals with the Arab Gulf states, I think that the Trump administration and the people pulling the strings, they're trying to foment some type of conflict, some type of proxy conflict between the Arab Gulf states and Iran, because it's just like a geopolitical reality that the US's boneheaded invasion of Iraq in 2003 created a massive power vacuum in the Middle East that Iran has assumed, and it's become a big regional player in that area of the world. And Iran is a very ancient civilization that, when it comes to governance, they're pretty durable, and their state is quite strong and more institutionally stable than a lot of the Arab petrostates. The Middle East has generally been dominated by empires since time immemorial. It's not like Europe, where it's had competing nation states and decentralized jurisdictions for the past 400 to 500 years. And I just think that there's no point in being in the Middle East now, due to the fact that the US is starting to become more energy self-sufficient due to the shale revolution and other innovations in the oil and natural gas sector. And if there's going to be any kind of geopolitical focus, it's either the pivot to Asia or something that's very Monroe Doctrine, Western hemispheric centric.
Well, right, and we did touch on that in the previous episode regarding South America and Central America. And as you write in your piece, which again I implore folks to go read it, it takes you around the world and in a short time, but really in-depth article. It's time for a geopolitical reset at the Mises.org/wire blog, and you can easily find Jose on there. But we talked about Iran sort of sidling up with Venezuela, for example, and Venezuela has done some deals, or at least has positive relations with China and Russia. So there is this nexus of China, Russia, Iran, and then swinging all the way over to South America. So as much as as much as realistically possible, we don't want the U.S. to be the policeman of the world. If Iran is that interconnected, ultimately, down the line with South America, it could become an issue. As you make clear, and you're not fear mongering whatsoever in any part of this article, as you make clear, Iran has not posed some existential threat to the United States, even with its resources and shady dealings in South America. But nonetheless, an issue to keep in mind. So what I am curious about going forward is, how do you see Iran growing in tangent with Russia and China in this era of like low oil prices? Do you think that Iran will be able to actually do business with these countries? I mean, we have news now that the United Nations embargo on weaponry on Iran has been lifted, and the U.S. is pushing for sanctions on anyone who does arms deals with Iran. So with the U.S. pressure plus the low oil prices, I just wonder if you expect major changes in Trump's second term, or how far down the line would Iran what timeline would it take to even theoretically see Iran as an existential threat, given the world stage?
I don't think it's much of a threat anytime soon. It's more of a threat, honestly, to the Arab countries and Israel. That's the main reason, to be honest, that the U.S. is still largely involved in the Middle East. And also because of China, unfortunately. I don't think there's going to be a full pivot to East Asia until like a decade from now, because a lot of these geopolitical experts on the neocon and neoliberal fold, they're all convinced that China is going to fill in a power vacuum in the Middle East. And to that I say, let them have it. Let them waste their blood and treasure on the Middle East, because there's just like no point in us really just staying there. Iran is probably just going to end up becoming a satellite state of China, the way that Pakistan has become for China. And it's going to become very heavily integrated. It may actually diversify its economy too, because it has a lot of other resources apart from oil. And the Iranian population is pretty skilled too. And they might grow steadily in the long term. I don't see them becoming a rising power, though. They're probably going to be just a middle power that will be relevant in the Middle East. But that doesn't mean that they're going to pose a threat to the U.S. I mean, if anything, the reason why they're pursuing a nuclear weapon is because of the fact that they're being encircled by the U.S. and they're generally surrounded by pretty hostile Arab states, and not to mention Israel. Once Israel acquired nuclear weapons, a lot of other Arab countries want that too.
And I think it might be up for argument whether or not Iran is pursuing a nuclear weapon. I think there's certainly an incentive for breakout capability to pursue that technological point where they can sort of flip a switch and produce weapons. And I'm no nuclear expert, but I think that capability on its own might be, at least Iran would hope, enough of a defense against some nuclear attack if they were able to produce weapons very quickly in case hostilities did increase. So, it's there is in a sense there's a very distinct line drawn between the civilian nuclear program and any would-be military nuclear program, which I don't believe that there's confirmation of. So given that, especially with maybe with these weapons deals, depending on how long it takes them to go through, Iran able to purchase some Russian or Chinese weaponry, I think that would really forestall nuclear weapons capabilities all the more, because then they would have more options, more conventional options. And then, as I say, perhaps they want to be on the verge of being able to produce nuclear weapons without actually going beyond that. That's just my opinion, and just from what I remember reading during the Iran nuclear deal under Obama. But anyway, so we've covered basically like Iran. There's no sense in fearing like Iran itself as an existential threat, even in the near to midterm, maybe long-term future. So what I'd like to ask then is, wouldn't it be in the U.S. interest to try and be more open to Iran, try and compete with Russia and China in that sense, instead of pushing Iran into the arms of Russia and China? I mean, is there any sort of play that a Ron Paulian or even a sort of like realist foreign policy could play where the U.S. might be able to make a deal with Iran? I mean, I don't really see that. Trump's not going to campaign on that for sure. So I don't even really see that in the second Trump term. But is there any situation where you could see down the road where the U.S. would try and play that game? Maybe not in the same way Obama did with the nuclear deal, but in a smarter, more tactful way. Do you see any possibility of that?
If you think about it, the Obama nuclear deal was a kind of realist move by the U.S. to somewhat keep Iran from falling into China and Russia's orbit, because it was basically designed in a way to promote some degree of cooperation between the two countries. I think it's in our interest to have somewhat of a détente with Iran to keep them away from China, because I think I'm looking more at the long game. Because China, long term, I do think can pose a really major threat to the U.S. You're talking about one of the longest lasting civilizations in history, with a very strong state and a functional culture. And the fact is, the U.S. is on the verge of entering a phase of just total social dysfunction. And if you're weak at home, it will spill over into your foreign policy. And I see no real point in being more hawkish with Iran. I think the best way to engage Iran is to lift these sanctions and somewhat normalize relations. I wouldn't go as far as to treat them the way we treat Australia or the UK, with really preferential trade deals. But I'm not a big fan of the post 1979 policy making U.S. has made towards Iran, and I'm definitely not a huge fan of military strikes or intervention in the country. I do think it should use more of a realpolitik in the way that we saw in the 20th century with regards to China and the Soviet Union being played off each other. I think that's like one of the more reasonable ways of going about it. But I think that now that the Iran nuclear deal was scrapped, I'm not sure if Iran is even interested in engaging in another type of deal of that matter. If they know that it's probably going to get torn up from one administration to the next, they're probably just going to place their bets with this trans-Eurasian type of geopolitical bloc that's emerging. In my opinion, it's almost inevitable because of how boneheaded U.S. foreign policy making is. And this goes beyond Trump or even Biden. I think the foreign policy blob ultimately has so much control, and they force a lot of these presidents to take these otherwise unpopular decisions just to placate the military industrial complex and continue the foreign policy think tank complex and make it continue to run for decades on end, because it's essentially a jobs program for a bunch of ivory tower geopolitical hacks.
Well, it certainly seems like the ship is impossible to re-steer like in time to avoid these calamities of our own making. I mean, this is really my argument against the sanctions regime. I mean, how ridiculous is it to think that the US sanctions are winning anything for the American people? And maybe just because the status quo sanctions regime is a complete failure, maybe that doesn't mean theoretically some precise well managed sanction wouldn't possibly work at some point. I guess I have to remain open minded because the world is a complicated place. But I gotta tell you, I mean, hearing your analysis of this, it really just it really pushes me into this non-interventionist camp. And it's like, what do we have to gain from a sanctions regime on Iran, especially since breaking off from this nuclear deal? Maybe it would actually, to counter to the conventional wisdom, maybe it would actually work in the U.S. benefit if the sanctions regime were totally dropped, if the U.S. didn't try to police the world and instead relied on, capitalism in the truest sense of the word to build bonds in a way that's longer lasting and better founded than down the barrel of the gun, so to speak. So, what do you think of this, Jose? I mean, do you think we're entering a world where, whether or not it's politically feasible, it may be so necessary for the U.S. to drop a lot of this stuff? I mean, it's such a complicated realm because you get into the economics of the situation, the hegemony of the U.S. dollar, and all of these budding, emerging alliances and things changing. I mean, I don't know what the U.S. relationship with Israel looks like in the long run, or the Gulf Arab states, or relationships almost anywhere outside of our Western Hemisphere, what they look like in the mid to long term. But it does seem to me that necessarily the U.S. is going to have to just back off and accept that these countries want to dominate their regions of the world in a way that has not been possible since, decades, almost a century ago. So what do you think of the prospects of non-interventionism, of ending the sanctions regime? Does that make more sense than trying to, still use force to get our way?
I'm of the opinion that unless there's a massive shift of consciousness regarding foreign policy interventionism, we're going to continue to just see permutations of neoconservatism and neoliberal interventionism pop up in DC. That's the long and the short of it. And on top of that, it will have to take, I think, a really massive military reversal that's probably going to be carried out by this Eurasian coalition to make Americans realize how overstretched their empire is. They have to get, if you want to put it bluntly, their comeuppance. The military industrial complex has to be defeated so decisively in some foreign theater that they change course. That's what really has to happen, I think, to change their ways, because the U.S. is still overwhelmingly this superpower, both economically and militarily. So it can get away with a lot of stuff for now. Oh, in addition, I think too, domestic upheavals could get so bad that it may be forced to retrench. That's another factor that cannot be dismissed. And to be honest, a lot of rival powers in the US, I think, may start exploiting a lot of US dysfunction to undermine it. I remember when the Black Lives Matter protests kicked off, you saw a lot of these countries like Iran, Turkey, and China just laughing at the US on Twitter. They had their diplomats joining in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter protests. And even, I think, one Chinese diplomat tweeted, "I can't breathe," almost jokingly, and in such an ironic fashion, given the fact that China pretty much has concentration camps for the Uyghur population there. But I think that kind of stuff is actually a sneak preview of how states will compete. It's not just going to be conventional warfare. You're going to have information warfare, space warfare, cybersecurity attacks, all that jazz. But yeah, the way the U.S. is going to probably have to shift as well. I could see one scenario where if China just becomes so powerful, because I do think that the multipolar world we're in right now is going to probably be more bipolar soon. It's going to be probably U.S. versus China, and I think if China just gets so powerful, the U.S. is just going to have to abandon a lot of its projects overseas and focus pretty much at least 90% of its efforts in containing China. But I think for the next 10 years, there's going to be probably somewhat less activity on the US's part because of the whole Wuhan virus disruption. A lot of other countries have been kind of rocked by that too. So you're going to see a lull. But I think the great power competition is going to really heat up once all these countries fully recover from the pandemic and reestablish their supply chains and get everything up and moving. But you'll probably still see forms of soft power in the forms of color revolutions and other subversive operations being conducted abroad.
Well, I love the point that you brought up there about these meta narratives being the weapons of war, these information wars, because we've known that this has been going on for longer than a decade, at least in the modern sense, in the age of the internet, the age of YouTube. I remember in the Ron Paul days when I was just a volunteer for Ron Paul, and it was incredible. We had sine waves. It was crazy activists doing crazy things. But the attention that we got was not from the local media or the national media, but from the Russian media, Russia Today. And, they get a lot of really undue over scrutiny. I mean, it's really ridiculous when you go and watch Russia Today on YouTube or Facebook, and they're like, this is Russia state controlled. And they don't say that for BBC or PBS or other outlets that are just as shady, if not more so than RT. But I bring up RT because, like you say, I mean, it could be them, other countries using information and soft power, propaganda wars like this. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. And I think this will open us up to a future episode that we'll have to talk about, because as freedom of speech comes under attack in the U.S., yes, some countries are going to be standing there waving Black Lives Matter flags, but I guarantee you other countries are going to be standing there waving, libertarian conservative flags. It'll be quite interesting to see where those of us who are patriotic Americans have to run to in order to host our programs. But that is a topic for another day. But you see now how I was saying at the beginning of the episode, how foreign policy can take you all over the map, even if you're trying to stay focused in one area of the globe. But then at the same time, I mean, foreign policy bleeds into the economic policy, into domestic policy. So I'm excited to talk about that, actually, now that you bring that up, about this propaganda wars and how countries face off, and our allegiance here on Order and Liberty, Jose, is never to the government, if I may say so, but to the country and to the people in the country and what's come before us, and we're trying to build something better off of that. But let me give you the last word on this episode, Jose. How would you want to wrap up your points and anything that I just said?
At the end of the day, if we want to see a more sane foreign policy, we have to continue to be gadflies and hold politicians and foreign policy analysts accountable, and continue to provide perspectives on these issues that go against the conventional wisdom. On top of that, build institutions that produce very good journalists, scholars, and people that can make their way up the State Department ladder, or whatever agency is dealing with foreign policy, the more credible people we can get, the better. And in that way, we can build a kind of political machine to offer an alternative. But I think, a multi-decade process. It's going to take a lot of work, but it can be done. People just have to start playing the long game, educating themselves, building up networks, and ultimately building up other people so that this information and work can be passed on to future generations.
Well said. Well said. It is a generational struggle, and so we're going to have to do a lot more, many more episodes on foreign policy, and maybe get into what we can do at the grassroots level to have an impact on the world. But just reading Jose's piece will give you a good start, good footing to better understand the direction of the world right now. So Jose, I really appreciate you talking about that. And why don't you go ahead and plug where folks can find out more about you? And we have been telling people where to find out about us individually, and that's great. But I also should point out we have social media accounts for Order and Liberty up that we're getting up, and so folks can find us on Facebook and Twitter and YouTube. So those will be linked below wherever we have this posted, right?
Indeed. You can find me at Jose Al Nino for Twitter. My Twitter handle is Jose Al Nino. And for those who want to join up and be a part of my newsletter, just go to josealnino.com/newsletter to receive my musings on politics. And you'll also get some of the articles I post at Mises.org, Big League Politics or Liberty Conservative News. You'll get my thoughts on that and also links to those articles. Now, for those of you who want to take your political game to the next level and receive more of my premium content where I talk about political strategy and high-level advice that can get you and a potential organization up and running and kicking butt in the political arena, subscribe to my Patreon at Jose Niño. You can look me up there, and you'll receive weekly content on some of my more long-form newsletters, in addition to other content that I put out regarding politics. But this newsletter, it has more actionable advice for those who actually want to win in politics.
All right, and you can see what I'm working on at nickhankoff.com. Everything is right there for you guys. Okay, well, Jose, we are at the end of our rope here, so it's going to be until the next episode. Thank you all so much for tuning in and being a part of the Order and Liberty podcast. We couldn't do it without you. So thank you so much. Have a good night, Jose.
Peace.